think it's my special pleasure to bring it back home to Australia now, from what has been a sunny day in Sydney or east coast of Australia so far. And welcome to Caroline Bowler as a repeat presenter, and Steve Vallas, great to have you for the first time at this conference series, but hopefully definitely not the last time. In fact, as Karim just mentioned, there is another one in middle of March with a fascinating theme. So I want to just briefly talk about both of your organizations. They're quite pivotal organizations for the blockchain and digital assets economy for Australasia, in my opinion. Caroline is the CEO of what is Australia's currently largest digital assets exchange, BTC Markets, and Steve Vallas is a president of Blockchain Australia, the peak industry association for the blockchain community and industry, with very strong inroads into government and so forth. So I think it's great to be able to inject a bit of an Australasian perspective on the trends of digital assets and blockchain developments and regional financial trends of the recent past in this regard. So if I can ask you to briefly introduce yourself, your background, and your organizations. I can't possibly do you justice.
Lovely. Well, I think ladies first maybe on this one. So thank you very much. It's a lovely intro. Thank you, Victor. So Caroline Bowler, I am the CEO of BTC Markets. And as you pointed out, we are the largest Australian digital asset exchange. We have been around since 2013, and we have approximately 280,000 and growing verified Australian account holders on our exchange. They've traded over $11 billion since inception, which in traditional markets may not be so significant, but for crypto here in Australia, that's quite a sizable chunk of the market, and something that we're very proud of. My own background, like many people who've been on this conference, is in traditional finance. I originally worked for a private client stockbroker in Dublin. That's where I cut my teeth. It was all paper-based flows, and then moved with a US investment bank, both in Dublin and then into Asia. So I've been in this part of the world. 2008, I think, is when I first landed in Singapore. So been around for some time and involved in blockchain since about 2015. I was involved with Access to the blockchain and crypto agents organization in Singapore, and so still have some roots in the region there, and then moved here to Australia recently, and have been with BTC Markets for nearly a year now. So it's been a fantastic year to be involved and to hold up such a fantastic organization during these really interesting times. But I'll probably just pass it over to Steve, because I know his story is even more exciting than my own.
I think that's generous, Caroline, and I think the characterisation that is we know each other, we have great affection for each other is in fact true. We're a small ecosystem, we're a particularly enthusiastic ecosystem, and hopefully at the end of this presentation, it'll be an ecosystem there's greater interest in participating in. As was suggested, I'm the CEO of Blockchain Australia. I've only been in this role for around 6 months. Someone asked me how long the interview process took. I said 4 years, because I've been in the space, having conversations, building relationships, recognising that there are a lot of people you need to get across the line in order for an ecosystem to thrive. Having taken on the role officially on July the 1st, I created an undertaking visible publicly, and I said I'm going to speak to 1,000 people in the first 100 days. It didn't take me 100 days. I spoke to 1,000 people, and not in rooms of 100, but in ones and twos, just to get a sense of what that landscape looked like. We're the peak body. The view that I bring is that if we talk to people who are blockchain people, and they're the only people we speak to, it's the wrong conversation for us to be having. There are lots of people who are committed to this space, and we know them. The challenge for us as an ecosystem, as for an organisation, and then ultimately for a global community, is to say to people who are adjacent to our worlds in financial services, in supply chains, in the reg tech environment, in government, give consideration to this subject matter. So that's what I've been doing. For the first time in 9 months, I'm here in Sydney, not in front of Victor, but I'm in Sydney dealing up with what is ultimately pent-up demand. You can excuse the backdrop, which is not the traditional office backdrop, but I've scheduled 30 meetings in 4 days. I'm in day 3. It's going non-stop, and the truth is there are too many people to get around to. So that's where we're at. We're in an exciting stage of the ecosystem, and hopefully that will be clear.
Very, very exciting. So I guess there's been a number of questions that have already been raised in earlier panels, but it's definitely worthwhile raising them again in the current context from an Australasian angle. What are some recent trends that or initiatives that you're aware of that is particularly relevant for global and cross-border investors from your perspectives? And if we can start with you, Steve, actually.
Yeah, I think the signals for us are pretty clear. Part of the reason I took in this role in an excited fashion is from the federal government's perspective, there's leadership with respect to this space. And I think for the longest time, people were waiting for the federal government to move, and they did that. They released a national blockchain roadmap in February of this year, and they identified within that roadmap a series of subject matters, a series of use cases that they think are of national significance. So those 4 use cases were supply chain issues of credentials, reg tech, and cybersecurity. So they're the signals. They're telling Australians this is what's important, and I think they're telling the world these are things that are on the agenda for us. Financial services weren't included in there because I think in some respects when you say financial services in the context of maturing ecosystem, it's too big a conversation to start. Whereas if you talk about reg tech, you can very quickly get into conversations around financial services. So I think it's not absent, but I think it's adjacent to all these other conversations. So those 4 subject matters are now being worked through. There are working groups. There's a national blockchain roadmap. I'm lucky enough to be the deputy chair of that roadmap. There are working groups that are now working through issues related to those subject matters. So we're now very strongly working with community members, government, and industry to educate as we build our confidence that they're use cases that people should be looking to. So Victor, they're the obvious 4 use cases. If we're going to start, we start with the obvious.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to Caroline. What are your thoughts on what Steve just mentioned and your own perspectives?
Well, I suppose just on the back of what Steve was talking about, the very fact that this roadmap was put forward, and as somebody who is obviously actively interested in seeing its success, it's been so encouraging to see both the support at government level, but also within the industry, the ground of support of people who have come forward to play a role to develop this roadmap and to push the industry forward, both in Australia but also affecting the wider region. So as somebody who plays a small part within that, it's very, very encouraging. And I think too, looking at the theme of this whole event about reflections and learnings and inspiration, I know that was something that I was certainly kind of contemplating before we came on. And for me, the reflection was, the accuracy of the prediction that this was going to be the pivotal year for blockchain adoption in the mainstream, particularly with, say, institutional players, and for us here in Australia, to a certain extent, also equally at government level. And I think that's that reflection, that certainly came true, that prediction. But my learning from it equally was that I hadn't realized the extent of the speed of the adoption. I don't think I anticipated quite how much and how quickly it would move, and thank goodness for it too. I mean, I would have been more gung-ho about it if I, in retrospect. But equally, I mean, you have to kind of have a certain note of caution with these things. You don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. But for me, that's definitely kind of the reflection and the learning on it. And equally with that, then the inspiration I take with me into 2021 is as much to do with the resilience of the community, both here in Australia, here in Melbourne. Obviously, we went through 101 days of lockdown and come out the other side of it stronger. And I think too that equally kind of speaks to the blockchain community. I can only speak to it here in Asia Pacific, but it has taken some knocks over the years, but still comes back stronger every time and comes back fighting fit. that there is such a passionate and engaged ecosystem worldwide. It's, you know, connecting through events like this, and also through the work that Steve does through Blockchain Australia and other industry bodies across the world. You know, this is really just getting such tremendous momentum. So for me, and, you know, sitting in my role at BCC Markets, that's where I take the inspiration from, and that's certainly where I see us pushing forward into 21.
Yeah, there was some earlier panelists sharing also their perspectives, mainly from North American and elsewhere, observations that this indeed has been a year of significant institutional participation, both in Bitcoin, but also actually a whole range of assets and instruments. We've seen JP Morgan coming out with their own digital token / crypto cash of their own. So that was really interesting. No wonder they were knocking Ripple and everyone else. What do you see, and this is a question to either of you, what do you see as some potentially exciting things or monumental things to look out for in 2021 with an Australasian perspective?
Victor, I'll jump in first this time, Caroline. Here's what I'm excited about. I'm excited about the boring things. This is an odd thing for us. The opportunity is in uncertainty at the moment. Australia is very lucky. We're open for business. You know, we're not in the same position that many nations are with respect to COVID-19 and the implications. We're open. Our supply chains are producing. You know, we're looking at things not just financial service based. We're saying, you know, what will make our economy stronger into 2021? And the reality for us is process improvement. You know, regulatory uncertainty is an interesting one, because I've come from, most of my conversations today involve people talking about regulation, and they all said uniformly almost the same thing. We want certainty. And I've said to them, you might not get the certainty you want. So whilst you wait for the certainty, you can probably build something. And whilst you wait for the perfect certainty, you'll probably find the thing you built wasn't perfect for the certainty you get. That's the lost message here. So from my perspective, the thing that I'm excited about is I think there's enough certainty from what I can see globally, as in there's a lot of movement. You can take your cues from what's happening, and then you come back to saying what businesses will be aided by the environment we find ourselves in. And in an Australian jurisdiction, I can tell you that fairly and squarely, we're looking at reg tech type applications. We want process improvement. I mean, it's a critical thing. It might not be the showstopper in some other countries, but from a jurisdictional perspective, if you can improve process, if you can make business better, if you can reduce costs, and that includes across financial services and digital assets, then you can build a business in this jurisdiction and you'll be supported to do it. So that's the thing for me. It says it's not necessarily the shiniest of all objects, but they're beautiful businesses that scale globally, and we're well placed to be able to support those kind of businesses.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really interesting angle, and particularly, Caroline, just before you comment, if I can ask you to perhaps, given your Singaporean experience, frame this, what Steve just said, literally around RegTech innovations in the digital asset space, in the context of the recently executed RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So how important is this, and what are the implications of the signing of this agreement in the context of regulation, RegTech, and so on in digital assets?
Well, I think any of these kind of pieces of cross-border international agreements are incredibly significant stepping stones to move it forward. I mean, as I say, my time in the industry started off when it was very, very nascent, and it was still small groups of people who are passionate coming together and imagining the scenarios that we're now living through, and in such a rapid pace of time. And I also agree with what Steve is saying, that, you know, these things aren't necessarily the sexy headline grabbers, but they're the foundational building blocks on which we build out the rest of the ecosystem and kind of put it through into other sections of our economy. And, you know, there's, the rules as code kind of perspective of bringing it into blockchain and how it can be used is such a fantastic compliance tool is certainly something for me sitting in an exchange that we look at and we examine that as a practical point. So, I mean, and also with these kind of international agreements and the opportunity to kind of cross-pollinate ideas and get some data standards around and blockchain standards, fantastic opportunities. I mean, these are all the kind of kernels that other business ideas can kind of use to grow and build their own businesses from. Obviously, I personally am deeply excited about it, but that would be part of course. Myself and Steve get together and have these very specific and technical conversations, and and that's why we're friends, because nobody else will sit around and listen to us talking about this stuff.
Well, actually, I think in this conference series, you find a lot of like-minded people who would love to hear what you have to say. More on that shortly. Also, there's been earlier conversations amongst the panels in terms of with the relative influx, perhaps not as big as expected, but certainly much bigger than, say, last year, the inflow of institutional capital into the digital asset space. Earlier, there were quite a lot of talk on the tokenization of commodities like gold and so on. And it's interesting that the Perth Mint has actually created a tokenized gold, to my knowledge. Can you talk more to that? And does that, how well does that play to Australia's commodity trading background as a country and to our trades overall?
Yes, I'm very happy to talk to that. I know Perth Mint, or PMGT, are listed here in Australia with one of the other exchanges, but we ourselves just recently launched another equivalent gold token, a token called MELD, which, rather than being centered on just one mint, it's actually a conglomeration of different independent kind of reserves and bullion dealers and so forth based around Australia. So clearly, there's an ecosystem building out around it. And I think where, to kind of speak to your point about the people who are trading these commodities, there's a recognition of the speed, the ease of use, the liquidity, etc., that you can get when you trade commodities in a digital token form. I know that for MELD, they've used Algorand as their partner, who we also now list too, as their blockchain of choice, if you like. So kind of speaking to that growing ecosystem of opportunities and options that are out there for different blockchain projects to come through. But just in terms of the interest, it's still very much in its nascent stages, but everything starts off in this way. And this is how you build it out, by building out those options and building out the variety for traders to come in. I know for us anyway, it's been a really interesting project with a really dedicated team, and it's something that we anticipate additional kind of interest as it goes into 2021.
And I think, sort of adding to that, if we go back a couple of steps and say, what are the building blocks that really do put a rocket up conversations around tokenization? Our financial services system is really strong. So the challenge that we have relative to others is we're pretty good. And I don't say that in a pat on the back version. That the structures are good, real-time payments are good, we have consumer data right, we have the open banking. We don't have a fractured system in a lot of ways that other organizations or other countries have. They've got a patchwork quilt, they're trying to fix it. Ours is not a patchwork quilt. That's the strength, again, from our ecosystem. Our system is good and strong. So if you try to oversell into our jurisdiction, and this is something that happens when I see people talking about what Australia should do, they don't understand they're building off firm foundations. So the question for us is, how do we make those systems better? Because if you come in and say we're going to displace a system, you're going to displace a system that is as good as anywhere in the world. You can make it better. Displacing it is a much harder sell. So that's one conversation. The one that then connects the dots between that and what we're talking about with tokenization and the Perth Mint and the like is Australians love property. I mean, we're a property hungry country. Much of our wealth is in property. Now, connecting those dots, if you make the case that you can make a system better, once you've done that, I think then going back and saying, great, now that the system is better, how is this reflected in assets? And for us, I think ultimately that will be one of the things that really, really does deliver value to people. Liquidity in stagnant markets. And you think about something like Australia's well known for its superannuation industry. It's enormous. The inflows are enormous. There are many, many, many billions of dollars held in property. This sort of technology delivers the potential to create liquidity, to create the ability to leverage and also to hedge against it. So they're the dots. And in some respects, I think in some other jurisdictions, you can start with a conversation about tokenization, and it's the right place to start because it's not as critical for us. We start the other side and we say, foundation is firm. Let's take these assets that are critically important. No one's moving quickly in states of Australia to change assets like property because they're too important. So again, when you look outside in, it's important to know that it is the store of wealth for most people. So before you go in there and say, let's change property, you need to understand most people are okay with most of those elements. So that's sort of the ecosystem connecting the dot exercise.
And I think too, if I can just jump in on that, you know, a few different points can spring to mind. One being that the introduction of these gold tokens, these commodity tokens, bring with them a different type of investor profile, in particular a retail point, into the market where they didn't previously comfort or the surety or I don't know the knowledge around what digital assets were about, but they're very familiar with commodities because that's been around since time immemorial. So this is a really useful stepping stone for them to come in and experience what it's like to trade a digital asset in terms of the speed and all of the execution benefits that we all know within the industry to be true. So I think that's another really important point, is that these are kind of like the gateway drug into the world of digital assets. But another point, I was at a dinner last night with other people in the financial technology industry. And one of the things that we talked about was here in Australia and the appetite for personal control over the portfolio. And for me, I've obviously spent some time in different continents around the world, and I hadn't really experienced, except here in Australia, the same fervor around having that ownership and having that control. I think perhaps in some parts of Europe and perhaps even into Asia, there's more of a hands-off, almost passive sense of investment where you'll give it to people who are, you know, financial advisors or into a fund and so forth. Whereas here in Australia, there does seem to be more of a sense of even just conversational around a dinner table where people would say, like, my father-in-law has asked me for some investment advice and where would I put my money and so on. And he hasn't got particularly large amounts of cash, but he's interested because it's just in the spirit of what you do here, which, I mean, you know, it's unlike a conversation I've had elsewhere. And as I say, that kind of conversation with other people who are in different segments of financial technology are likewise kind of sharing anecdotes. And if I may, you know, just in the spirit of another anecdote, I was talking to somebody who works in what we would classify as the traditional financial services here in Australia. And he was talking about the change in behavior, the change in trading behavior that they're seeing on their platform. And they dug a little deeper into it, and they found that it's perhaps the millennial age group who have cut their teeth in investing and trading on crypto exchanges and digital assets, who have no problem whatsoever with volatility, are very happy to move in and out of positions, you know, whatever suits their strategy, but have a confidence perhaps in trading behavior that they hadn't experienced. So they're seeing a lot more of that kind of, I suppose, more rapid movements on a retail investor than they had previously. So in other generations that were used to, I suppose, the more traditional rigor as opposed to the 24-hour, 7 days a week speed that you see or you're used to in digital assets. So really interesting to see that cross-pollination that we spoke about. It's bleeding out into the wider financial services. But with that, then the traditional players are going to have to get used to this new type of behavior and are going to have to build and tailor new products to suit them. And you know, coming from the kind of the speed of execution, again, as I speak about within our own exchange, you know, we've set the bar pretty high. So we're interested to see how the banks are going to be able to pivot and change and keep up. And I welcome that, because I think everybody should be looking to, you know, improve and have that competitive edge. And you know, you need to keep you sharp and to keep you you know, relevant for our client base. But obviously that's something that we're very passionate about here. And myself and Steve, as I said, we could keep going on.